Hello and welcome to Supercharged, episode 193. I'm Adam Dachis.
And I'm Tommy Houghton.
And today we are joined by Federico Pistono, who is an entrepreneur, technologist, author, and you're the head of blockchain for Hyperloop Technology too, is that correct?
Hyperloop Transportation Technologies, yes.
Yes, so you do a lot. Can you tell us a little bit about your background? We're actually going to be talking about universal basic income today because I saw you talking about it, and I've been wanting to discuss this with someone who's an expert for a while. But you do a lot of things, so I think the audience would be interested to hear kind of what you've accomplished in your life.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and glad to be here. So let's see, should I start with, just what I'm working on now, or maybe the things that brought me to where I am? I don't know, which angle would you like to take?
Let's go backwards. What's happening now and how did you get there?
Okay. So right now I'm involved in a few projects that I've started either with other people or that I kind of began on my own, and then you have people joining in your adventure. I think the leitmotif on all of them is to kind of drive positive social change, but kind of scaled back my, I wouldn't say that I scaled back my goals, but certainly the time frame and the scope. I think in the past I was fueled by some naivete about how activism can change the world, and right now I have a much more pragmatic approach. I may not look like it, but I'm old enough to have seen a few things and how things don't change very quickly. And complex systems, when you try to change or tweak them, usually you do it for the worse, not for the better. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where I'm at now. And I'm trying to have an impact in different ways. I'm also an angel investor, invested in more than 20 companies, and the idea is always to try to invest in my time and my resources and expertise and knowledge and money in things that I think can move humanity forward, whether it's in the medical sector to help people who are struggling with diseases or things like that, to getting people access to information, wireless technology, transportation, so removing barriers either from the banking sector, so access to credit or access to capital, the freedom to move, freedom to communicate, to express yourself in different ways, to educate yourself. These are kinds of the things that interest me a lot.
So why is that, though? Because not many people feel that way. Not a lot of people who, especially those with money, always think, oh, I want to do what's right for society or do what can help other people who are not necessarily in as good of a position as me. Why did you decide to put your resources into work like this?
Well, I guess it's because I was born in a very humble environment where we didn't have a lot of resources or anything like that, and even when my family at some point might have had, but I was very little. I was always brought up with those values of community, of compassion, and kind of like you're not an individual entity. You're part of something. You rely on other people. In the beginning, you rely on your parents. Otherwise, you die. And it's as simple as that. And you're a family, and family is probably the most important thing you'll ever have in your life. Either the family you're born in or the family that you build yourself, or the close friends that become your family for those who don't have a family. And if you extend that concept, you kind of realize that there is a larger extended family that you rely on, and that is your community or your country, or it could be the group of people who share certain values that you work with or you spend your time with. And really, no one can live by themselves. So, you kind of extend this idea. And you don't even need to be particularly compassionate. Even on a very pragmatic approach, there is very strong group selection in evolutionary terms to push you towards collaboration and share of resources, share of wealth and knowledge, because it's it's a non-zero sum game. You can get better as others get better. And in fact, our society has proven over and over again that as societies get better and more educated, and they have access to information, health, capital, and so on, then you get better, because the hundreds of millions of people who are now dying because of preventable diseases, or they don't have access to education, they might find the cure for your cancer 20 years from now. So it's in your self-interest to actually have everyone else lift up and express their potential.
What do you think prevents people from seeing this a lot? Because obviously not, as I said earlier, not everybody's out doing everything for everybody else. And I think the message that you are putting out here is a very valuable one that a lot of people don't hear very often. And it's like to the point where, I feel the same way, and I don't have the resources you do, but I'm very keen on spreading the word. And it's a relief to just hear it, to hear somebody else actually think that, and say these things. So, what sort of difficulty have you run into in trying to convince people that it's in their own best interest to help others, because then we all rise up and are better off for it?
Well, in some sense, I think everyone kind of understands it, but it's just that it's broadening the definition of their extended family. So for some people, their in-group is their extended family, and everyone else, they don't care.
Yeah.
So it's in their interest to only preserve their tribe. And they're very, very... So if you look at the people who are very conscientious, people who are very conservative, for example, they're usually much nicer people than radical chic kind of people who say, let's save the planet, let's save the world, but then they're kind of assholes in real life, and they're really bad with their friends, really. And they preach a lot of good stuff, but in practice they're not really nice. And some conservatives who may not care about the planet or people on the opposite side of the world, they're incredibly good people with their immediate family and their immediate surrounding tribe. Mm-hmm. So I think it's about, on one side, the liberals have to realize that they can't be so hypocritical sometimes. And conservatives, it's a bit more like extending their idea of who their family is. And that comes to a lot of group identification, which is, I think, a problem in society, but it's how we evolved. We're, tribal in nature. So it's a bit like, I think it has to do with ego depletion. And I want to clarify maybe that, because a lot of people think that ego and, or being egotistical or being selfish has something to do with the ego. They are related, but they're completely different things. Ego depletion is really about not focusing on yourself so much within your thoughts and your frame of reference, but thinking of the larger context in which you are inside. And meditation can help you with that. Transcendental experiences, psychedelic experiences, religious experiences can give that. And I think that there needs to be some sort of awakening inside the person to realize that you are part of a bigger whole, not just at the intellectual level, but at the visceral level. Because you don't, before, so action is preceded by realization inside of you. And I could talk to someone for 5 hours about being, receiving an epiphany, but it would mean nothing to them unless they have it on their own. So it's first you have an experiential level, which leads to action, and then you kind of use your prefrontal cortex to make sense of what's happening, and then think about the future and make plans. But a lot of people, and especially in the liberal side, they think if I could just tell people the truth, then they would act differently. But that's not the case.
When was your moment of experience leading to your epiphany?
So there wasn't a particular moment. As I said, it has to do a lot with my parents and my upbringing. So the basis for that was there. Then, the things that I've read over the years have influenced me a lot. The free software movement, Richard Stallman, and kind of the hacking community and the idea of cypherpunks. but also ideas of the Enlightenment and humanism have been very influential to me, and secular thinkers such as Bernard Russell, or even kind of somewhat esoteric, but still in the, I would say, not job category, like Alan Watts. So those were very influential in my life.
So, in terms of actually, I guess, getting people on board with the message, or let's actually turn the conversation to universal income, because that's or universal basic income, because that's where we're headed today. In terms of getting people on board with that, to explain just really quick to the audience, and please feel free to fill in this definition, because I'm sure you are better at this than I am. The universal basic income is not so much a handout as it's a means of using resources that the government has to provide money for people for their basic needs, so they can afford things like healthcare and a place to live and food, and concentrate on contributing to society on top of that, so that they're not struggling to get by every day, and we don't have issues with. I think personally that it has the potential to correct a lot of issues in society, that such as a lot of the gun violence we experience in the United States. Just looking at the statistics of the gun violence, it seems awfully.
So I think this kind of definition goes well with the liberal side, but it's a bit biased, and it wouldn't go well with someone who's on the conservative side.
Yeah,
because you could just as well define the basic income as a baseline of opportunity given to people so they can pursue their own in their own way how they want to position themselves in society. So someone might pursue their self-interest, someone might dedicate themselves to others, but you're not loading the definition with what you would like them to do. You're just providing a blank slate and say, here is the basic needs. Now go figure out what you can do. Whether it is for your own self-interest, or for the interest of others, or for the community, or for the collective, that's up to you.
Yeah, and I think that part of the problem with people helping others a lot of the time is that they think, oh, this person does or does not deserve it. I want to know that my money, or money in general, or whatever resources that are being provided, are going to people that actually deserve them, that will do something good with them. And I think we have to get away from this concept of who deserves what, because there are always going to be people who take advantage of any system, and there are always going to be people who don't and are helpful. But if we are moving in a direction where we encourage contributing to society, contributing in ways that are functional and better for everybody, and are spreading the word of doing, of contributing in a way that helps us and helps other people, then hopefully that would move in a good direction. But there are obviously a lot of practical issues in terms of implementing something like this, and whether or not it will work or cause other problems is another
but
thing.
You see, even in the rhetoric there, even in the philosophy there, I think you if you want bilateral support, you have to be as agnostic as possible. Mm-hmm. So again, you're pushing your own views, which people might agree or disagree with. Mm-hmm. But on the conservative side, especially, they might not like some of the words they use, because it's a trigger warning for them.
Oh yeah.
So how do you sell this to someone on the conservative side?
Well, you don't sell it. You're basically saying, right now we're giving hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies for businesses who might not be alive or profitable just because they're bribing the government. So you're taking away those subsidies, and we're making it a blank slate, and we're giving people equal opportunity to start, and then they can work their ass off and become better if they want. That's how I would phrase it to conservatives. Now, it's the same exact thing, but if you phrase it this way, it aligns perfectly with their values.
I think the whole question of, even if you end it with if they want, because the idea of most conservatives that are on the side of saying it's self-reliance would argue that, the people would need to pull themselves up by the bootstrap. It's not an if they want to, they need to. So the idea is this.
No, but see, the thing is that already now a lot of people are getting So, for example, right now you're not paying for the air you breathe.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we think that's obvious, but it's not very obvious, because you go to some place in China and you don't get free air, clean air. You pay for that. Okay, so it's not as obvious. And in a totally self-reliant society, you don't have clean water, you don't have clean air, you don't have streets, you don't have police, you have private guards, you have fences with electrified barbed wire and that kind of thing. So it's Somalia. That's a real self-reliant society. Nobody wants that. Everybody wants a sweet spot where you have enough provided to you so you feel safe to start off to do the things that you want to do. And essentially, we're just extending the definition from basic water and air and street access to also food and shelter and energy. And healthcare. It's not that big of a leap if you phrase it this way.
Now, you also, it seems, have to educate people who are conservative that the government's involved in those functions, where they tend to...
It might not be, and that's my point, right? Because you're loading the rhetoric when you say the government has to provide these things. It might not necessarily have to be the government, because the goal isn't the government doing X, Y, and Z. The goal is for people to have the basic needs fulfilled, so they can pursue who they want to become in life and position themselves in society in a productive way that works for them. Whether that works for them only, for them and their family, them and their community, or them and the entire society, it's up to individual to decide, right? But the goal is to give the baseline to people, is not for the government to get involved and do X, Y, and Z. It might get involved or it might not. So there are ways, for example, for the government to not get involved, and for companies, for example, to voluntarily pull money into a pot, into a fund, which is used for a basic income. And you could literally make it out of S&P 500 or people or the companies in the stock market. So there are other ways of financing a basic income which is not directly related to the government. And there are many different mechanisms for that. And when you allow for many ways to for non-governmental ways also, which might or might not happen, then you allow for the creativity of the entrepreneur to come up with different solutions. But if you frame the question as only the government does X, then by definition you have opposition from the conservative side, and you never get anywhere because you'll never have bilateral support.
No, could you ever see an example of a company doing this long term and it actually helping?
Yeah, I mean, Google, Facebook, and Apple are already doing this for their own employees and their own shareholders. Right? So if you find mechanisms to extend that to consumers, for example, and the blockchain is a perfect way that you can do it. Because if you're a token holder, you are actually also a shareholder of the company, which is the crypto. So the concept of having equity, being a shareholder, being a consumer, being an employee, or being an owner, or have stocks, these are all different ideas and different concepts, different financial instruments, and different relationships that you have in the old world. But in the crypto world, they're all combined into one. If you're a token holder, you have voting power, you have equity, you are a user, you're a consumer, and you're also an owner.
Right.
So there are ways to finance possibly basic income through voluntary means via a consortium of companies that pull in money, or even the network itself doesn't have any owners, and any token holder has a stake in the network. And you could pay out dividends from the profits of the network to all the participants in an equal way to start, and people can do economic activity on top to gain to have more money. So there are many, many ways that you can do very, very creative things to provide potentially for basic income in the future. And crypto is one such way to do it.
Okay, so, but with, I want to jump back really quick to something you said at the beginning of your answer. You're saying that Google, Facebook, Apple they're providing something like this for their employees already. Can you explain that in more detail? Are we talking about the sorts of benefits that they're providing, because they're obviously paying them? So what is it on top of that they're getting that would qualify as a UBI?
Right, because that's what they want. They want, so right now companies like Google, Facebook, and Apple and so on, they're competing for talent. And because of that, they want to retain the talent as much as possible. So they try to give them everything that they need. They don't just give them a salary. Sometimes they give them a house, free transportation, free food, free healthcare for them, for their kids, nursery, entertainment, fitness. They try to give them everything that they might need, so they keep them there. Now, this obviously doesn't scale to the whole population, because the whole point is that some people are better than others at doing some jobs, and therefore that's why you want to track them. But the concept is this, right? So if a company has an incentive to do it, they will do it. So what is the incentive mechanism that you create for society to then provide to all of its citizens? And if you look at places like Norway has essentially a basic income in place. It's just not called like that. But that's precisely what it's doing. Norway has found a way to capitalize on the resources of the land by declaring them common heritage of its people, creating a $1.2 trillion fund which is growing every year, which is ready to be used should anything happen. And when someone gets if someone gets in trouble because they get fired somewhere, to actually have more upward mobility, a lot more than in the US, by the way, where a lot of people think that because you can fire anybody at will, there is a lot of mobility. Actually, that's a myth. It creates a lot of stagnation because people are afraid to lose their job because they lose their health insurance, so they're kind of held hostage by the companies. What happens in Norway is you are free to fire anyone at will, and companies don't need to stay afloat if they're not profitable. They can declare bankruptcy. The government steps in, pays for 80% of the salary for 2 years. Meanwhile, you have to do training. You either look for another job, which qualifies you to do something of higher income, or you do training to become better so you can earn more money with your next job. And if you don't do the training, the government stops paying you. If you don't look for a job, the government stops paying you. So essentially it gives you a buffer of 2 years in which you can make yourself better, and then you can find a job which pays more and that works better for the community and the society around you. So it gives you the freedom to essentially explore what you want to do, whether you want to go back to study or become a better engineer or do a specialization that you might have wanted to do in the past. And maybe the job that you do now doesn't exist anymore or is not required anymore. And so you have to learn new skills. And the government steps in, allows you to have that freedom, and then you can become a better member, a more productive member of society, which is in the interest of the government, because if you earn more money, you create more economic value and you pay more taxes. So the whole cycle works.
When there are a couple of things that I'm wondering about that setup, though. So if just to clarify, for one, with in terms of Norway, if the government's paying you and you stop looking for a job because maybe you wanted to learn a new skill, they're still going to pay while you are learning this new skill.
No, you have two choices. You either train yourself to have new skills, or you look for a job.
Okay. So that's that.
But if you sit on your ass, do nothing, the government doesn't pay you anymore.
Yeah, that sounds completely fair. But with in regards to the resources that Norway has to be able to provide this, and we're talking about resources of the land, things change over time. How do you deal with the situation, I guess hypothetically, if the government no longer the resources that the government is using to generate revenue to handle these sorts of situations? What if what happens if those resources lose their value and they're no longer able to have that kind of fund? Because we've seen that happen currently with governments having like a singular resource and then no longer being able to sustain the economy when it kind of tanks in value.
Well, you have to create a virtuous cycle. So Norway has never used the oil money to finance any of this. Norway has used the oil money to create the rainy day fund, which has been growing exponentially every year. But they've never used that money to fund any of the infrastructure or the social programs. They have used it at the beginning as a buffer, And after a few years, they have created a virtuous cycle where they were generating more money through their healthy economy than they would have through the natural resources. And again, they have abandoned ideology, and that's why they're so successful with their fund. Instead of making it a social fund like Venezuela, which is prone to immense corruption, or privatizing everything like they do in the US. If you find a new oil well, you found it, you make the money, and that's it. They found a sweet spot because they don't have really an ideology except making things work for everyone. So they know that the private sector is really good at managing things and maximizing profits, which the public sector is terrible at. But the public sector is really good at providing a stable situation for people and a vision for the future of society. We have inspired leaders, but they can't micromanage. So for them, it was very simple. When they found the oil, they said, this is a common resource of the Norwegian people, but we don't want to put the government on top of it. So they create the company called Statoil. Now, Statoil is a private company, privately managed and privately owned. They can hire and fire at will. They have their own bonus structures. They have all the great things about capitalism, but they only keep 10% of the profits. 90% goes back to the fund, which is owned by all the people in Norway. So the company managing it has an incentive to perform because they can get part of the profits. But the vast majority goes back to the people. That's a great model because it uses the best of capitalism and the best of the social structure, the social safety net.
Yeah, that does sound quite nice. I wonder if we were to talk about doing something similarly in the United States, what I think at least what gets thrown around politically a lot of the time is that it will stifle innovation if we put restrictions on people. Obviously there is an incentive to perform, but I wouldn't be surprised if U.S. politicians start making direct comparisons to the innovations that come out of the United States and out of Norway. And while I don't...
Well, they can, and they would be at fault because Norway has much more innovation than the United States per capita. A lot more. So they have more patents, they have more startups, they have more income per capita, they have more scientific advancements, they have more academic credibility per capita. They outperform in the US in every single sector of the economy, science, technology, and innovation.
I'm not familiar with necessarily all of... I think of... I don't disagree with that in any way. I guess I should say, because I think generally speaking, it's not that hard to beat the U.S. in terms of anything that requires intelligence. I say as a U.S. citizen.
That's not true. U.S. is really good at certain things.
We are, yeah, but we're not the smartest people on average in terms of, because education is just not valued here as much as it should be. And I'm not saying that we couldn't be. It's just that's just kind of how things went, I guess. But when I think of when I think of what the U.S. values as innovation versus other countries, it seems to be more of a consumption productized sort of situation, and I worry that the things that you're talking about, especially in the scientific area, as much as like I personally think that I wish the United States was more engaged with science, and I think a lot of citizens are, but when it comes to the money that gets spent, that does not add up. So I feel like the innovations that the U.S. appreciates are things like iPads, which I wouldn't necessarily call innovations. They're not bad, they're just, it's a consumption product. So in terms of, I think it's easy to sell the argument on how to make people's lives better, but there's always that looming communism BS that kind of sits on top. People love to just label everything here as socialism or communism, as if it's a dirty word. But
that's my point. It is a dirty word if you don't understand the social context in which you're using it. And so that's why I was making the point that the Scandinavian countries are shying away from ideology. because there is not a single example of socialism or communism that hasn't produced disastrous results. And there isn't a single example of completely free market which hasn't produced equally tremendous results. I mean, horrible results.
Yeah.
But on a smaller scale. The thing is, if you want to have an honest conversation, you don't talk about socialism or capitalism. You talk about the degree to which you want the government to intervene in what exactly, and what are the freedoms and the duties of citizens, right?
Okay.
Because that's the conversation to have. And then if you label something communism or socialism or capitalism or whatever, you're just going back to these false dichotomies that don't advance the conversation.
Let's talk about it practically then. In terms of implementing obviously we've heard a practical example in terms of how Norway approaches it. If you were to, say, try to establish a universal basic income in the United States, and I think we have to kind of look a little bit at what, how that cost would be spread out and where the money would come from. Do you have any approaches in mind? I mean, obviously you've talked about the businesses stepping in, but I mean, in terms of kind of how this would, if we were to start today, if some people who have the ability to do something were to start today, what would be an approach on the government side, and then on the private sector that you think would actually function in the United States? And what would the results be, I suppose, in terms of how
the United States says 335 million people?
Yeah.
If you want to be serious about
a little bit less if we're not counting children.
If you want to have, if you want to be serious, no, you have to count children.
I mean in terms of paying out an income.
No, but it's part of the equation, because if you're going to pay the same amount to people who don't have children, you're going to have issues.
Yeah, that's
but the thing is, and children get paid in a basic income just a lot less until they get 18 in the models that they've run. If you want to be serious about a 300 plus million country, you have to make a 20-year plan. There is no other way to do it. If you start today, I would do pilots of small towns or neighborhoods within cities for the next 5 or 6 years. Gather data, get feedback, learn from mistakes, repeat, do it over and over, expand the programs that work well, cut down the programs that don't work or close them off and replace them, and continue the process until you see if there is something working or not, and how that play out on a global scale. As you do it, you treat it like a startup. It's an evolutionary approach. So if you want to be serious about basic income, you have to think about a rollout period of 10 to 15 years and then 20 years to stabilize, if the premise is even workable, which we don't know at this point.
So I guess I'm wondering where we can get all the money from in a lot of cases, because I mean, like, when you're talking about universal basic income, how much are we talking about per I mean, if we're talking about a Norway situation, it doesn't work quite in the sense that you get a paycheck from the government and go about your life. But if we're talking about having to pay out a certain amount of money on average to people on a yearly basis, if that in the US, if that's $18,000, which isn't a lot but is enough to be helpful, I mean, that's what, like 4.5 trillion at least a year. So where do you think is the best place to get that money from?
Well, I mean, the best place is not to think of these terms, to be honest. The best place is to run pilots and see, because in the end, you don't really need a certain amount of money. You need a certain amount of money relative to the size of your economy and to the cost of life. Because a basic income in center of New York or center of San Francisco would be a lot different than basic income in Pittsburgh or in rural Montana.
Would you say that there are certain measures of what a successful pilot program would look like?
Yeah, I would say so. Pilot program has to be randomized. There needs to be a control group. Otherwise, you don't know what you're accounting for. So you have to control for variables. It has to run for a significant amount of time, which is longer than 2 years. there needs to be at least 20 to 50,000 people involved, otherwise the sample size is too small. And then you have to compare the control group to the group that you're testing for specific specific items that you're selecting. So whether it is a level of entrepreneurship, or if there is increase in education, decrease in mental illness, hospitalization rates, depression, people finding more fulfilling their lives, life satisfaction index, income. I mean, there is maybe 20 dimensions that you want to account for, and you have to be very careful at how you measure them, and you don't corrupt the data, because you might have one variable that you didn't account for, which destroys 5 or 6 of your variables because it's tainting the data and you didn't notice it. That's why you want to have a lot of pilots with the conditions that I've outlined, so you can average out and then see some of the outliers and try to understand where you're doing good work. That's what you should be doing more of, and put more resources into it. And places where it's not working. But to your point before about the $4 trillion, that's not really the calculation to do. Because if you think about it, first of all, I don't subscribe to the idea that a country of 53 states, of which only 3 are not recognized officially, a country of 53 states, 330 million people, as large as a continent, can be uniformly managed by a central government. I mean, that sounds completely insane. I think that you should have certain things that are the same for everybody, which is directly comes out of the Constitution, and then states should have a lot more freedom. Look at you have states in the U.S. that are larger than countries in Europe, and if you just look at some of the most successful countries in Europe, like Switzerland, each canton has its own rules and tax structure, and they have competition between cantons, and cantons are smaller than neighborhoods of cities in the US.
So with that in mind, how do you feel about the EU?
Sorry, go ahead.
How do you feel about the EU in that case, if we're talking about, I guess, governments that are... calling them I don't know if calling them a government is the right thing, but
the EU has been trying to standardize all the irrelevant things, and they haven't standardized all the important stuff. So the things that we need to be, in my opinion at least, but I'm not an expert in global foreign policy and international cooperation between countries, so I might be just talking out of my ass. But in my feeling, I've been following some politicians that I respect, feel the same way, is that we should have a common army, common borders, common immigration policy, and common tax structure. Those are the things that matter, right? Those are the things that we should be, spearheading from the beginning, and we actually have found agreements of none of them. We have agreements on the size of the freaking windows on on government buildings, or the distance between the beginning and the end of the chair, in all this nonsensical stuff. They have all sorts of millions and millions of rules that nobody cares about, and really we need standardization for that. It took them 15 years to uphold a symbol law, which was to have no roaming charges between the states, and still it's not completely applicable to every state, which is insane. And these are like things that people really care about. We have no common immigration policy, no common tax structure, so you can have loopholes of countries that do double Irish Dutch sandwich, and actually your companies. Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, they pay zero taxes, 0.0001%, thanks to this nice loophole in Ireland and in the Netherlands.
Apple is my favorite Irish company.
Yeah. So that's the problem with the EU. It's not standardizing the things that it should, and it's focusing on all the relevant things, and they're wasting all their time discussing things that no one cares about. But Think about, for example, just a quick side note, otherwise I'm going to ramble on too much.
No, go ahead.
We have, 150,000 immigrants that come off the coast. So most of them, they arrive in Italy or Greece, just because we are close to the coast. Almost none of that percolates up to the Nordic countries, just because they're farther away and they're not accessible by sea. But why should the Italians or the Greeks put their police force, their health authorities, their Red Cross, and all of their resources to host all of these hundreds of thousands of immigrants with no help whatsoever from the European Union?
Yeah,
they're coming to Europe. They're not coming to Italy. They're coming to Italy just because they're so desperate and it's close by and it's by the sea. But they want to come to Europe. So if Europe isn't putting its own bases there to help with its own doctors and police and health workers and so on, then what is the union good for if it's not to have a common ground on the things that matter, right? And then you have a treaty that actually compels countries to take a certain number of immigrants because of political persecution and because they're escaping oppressive governments or they might be in danger of death in their own country and things like that. And countries like Austria, they're like, yeah, fuck that, we're not going to take them. And what is the repercussion of that? Nothing. They don't pay anything. So if you go over the 3% ratio of your deficit is if it's over 3%, Brussels will cut you off, will kill you, will cut off the bloodline, and you will essentially bleed to death. But if you don't, and it's a simple, like 3%, by the way, it was completely arbitrary number. Like there is no scientific and economic established reason why 3% is the magic number. They just made it up one day and they're going with that. And actually, there is a lot of evidence that it's bleeding out the countries, and now it's not allowing them to lift off from the depression. But that's another story. But on real things like how do we handle immigrants, there is no enforcement whatsoever of the rules. So that's the biggest problem in Europe, I think.
Do you think the enforcement of the rules in the U.S. now is a different solution, or what's your opinion on immigration in that sense?
Man, immigration in the U.S. I don't think I should open that can of war.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is absolutely fair.
But in terms of immigration with economic policy and something like this, how do you address the concerns, or do you put like a waiting period or a buffer zone into, obviously you don't want to necessarily shut off immigration completely, but having it be just a porous border is also, so how do you find a middle ground?
Right, so that is through conversation. So on one side, there is just a purely humanitarian side. People who are asking for political asylum, they should be granted political asylum if it's legitimate. If you're in danger of death from their own country, because their government might kill them, or because there is militia groups that have burned down their house and then they want to kill them for religious reasons or things like that, I think we have a moral responsibility to offer asylum, which could be a few months temporary asylum, and then if they want to become members of society and functioning citizens, then there is a process for that to get them integrated. But for short-term political asylum, countries that have the means should offer it. On the other side, I think we have to be very pragmatic. Like you look at the carrying capacity of the country. How many people can come in, be a productive member, and not overwhelm the economy? It turns out that probably it's quite a few more than the US is allowing in. But because it's putting the limit so low, a lot of people are pouring in the country because they're so desperate and they know that there is opportunity. And so I think it's a bit like if you're making unreasonable rules, no one's going to respect them. That's why taxation in Switzerland works so well, because taxes are very low, but they're in a way they're fair because everyone pays taxes, and people get what they deserve. So the canton, I think 85% of the tax stays within the canton, 15% goes to the federal government. And I'm assuming in the US is the exact opposite.
Yeah, I mean, well,
that's the point. So for every dollar you spend, 50 cents go to the army to finance wars that you don't agree with. So a lot of people in the US are like, why should I pay taxes for the system that I don't agree with? But if 85 cents for every dollar that you spent went on the roads on your own city, the buildings and the hospitals and the health workers and the social security and the pension and everything that is within your own community and the things that you see and the bridges that are not collapsing and everything is polished and it's working and it's new and it's fixed because your taxes paid for it and you can see it with your eyes, people might be a lot more willing to pay taxes because they see where the taxes are going. And there is a lot of economic theory that proves, in my view, that the further away the effect of your tax is, the less likely you are to participate in the government deal.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense, and I guess that goes to, you know, having a federal government that controls so much is very much an issue, because I think that a lot of people, I mean, if you were looking at the U.S. specifically right now, the amount of people who want to fund the military, I think, is quite high. I am assuming, based on pretty much everything I've seen throughout my life, that it's somewhere around half of the population at least. But I don't, I mean, I think it's a hard number to really figure out.
It's a little even higher because the military is always a popular thing to support the troops. I think the idea of funding for the military is always an easy thing to do because it's national security.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think people...
It's a political point.
It is, but the problem...
But there's a flip side, right? If half the population supports the military, that means that half the population either doesn't or they kind of do, but they don't really want to spend all that money on the military on the things that they do.
That's the hard part with the military, is any subject like that is considered a third rail of politics, because if you can still be in favor of the military but also be in favor of reducing its cost or cutting it.
Sure.
And that's the thing, is oftentimes because of that conflation, that's so easy to do by saying, oh, you want to cut costs of the military, therefore you hate the military. People often don't go that route. So I would suspect that's why you see a lot of people, I feel like, handcuffed to always support, always raise how much you give to the military.
Yeah.
Well, that's part of the government propaganda of, if you're not agreeing 100% with everything that I say, it means you're an enemy.
Yeah, it's binary, black or white. You're with us or against us.
Yeah, which would be nice if we could get past that. But before we run out of time, I want to make sure we have a minute to talk about artificial intelligence, because I think that is one of the main drivers for the conversation of the universal basic income nowadays. It's not the first time something like this has come up, but it's coming up a lot because people are worried about self-driving cars taking, about a third of the jobs away in the United States, among other places. I mean, AI has the potential to remove a lot of tedious or just general, even computer programming. It can...
automation alone.
Yeah, there's just a lot of stuff that people won't have to do anymore, which on one hand is lovely because it's nice to have a machine that can do the work for us, but on the other hand, we need to, make money and live and so on. So universal basic income, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but for the audience's sake, that seems to be the main reason this conversation is happening so much these days. So with that coming forward, Federico, do you think that a universal basic income is going to be a necessity once AI starts eroding jobs on a significant level? How long do you think we have, and what are your thoughts on that situation in general?
I think that a lot of people are overestimating the speed of how fast true AI can become a reality. And at the same time, they're underestimating how narrow AI is going to disrupt so many jobs before we even get close to anything that resembles a true artificial general intelligence. So I think there's two things that are being confused there. On one side, artificial general intelligence refers to the idea of creating an intelligence on a silicon substrate, which is as smart as a human being on everything that we consider a human being good for. And that can be generalized in the sense that you can give any problem to this intelligence and it will find a way to solve it. That's not at the horizon, not anytime soon.
Mhm.
At the same time, we have specialized narrow AIs who can do very, very effective searches on. Essentially, it's an optimization algorithm for very specific purposes, and those can be quite fast, quite dramatically. And let me give you an example. The moment that we created a player, an artificial player that was good enough to beat some mediocre player of Go, it took maybe 20 years of hard work to get from nothing to that point, maybe more, 30 years. Then the moment that we had a mediocre player to the moment we beat the world champion was 3 months. Then the moment we had an AI capable of beating the world champion to an AI capable of beating that previous AI 100 times out of 100 was only 2 days.
Yeah, I remember that study coming out.
And the reason that it was created like that is because the latest version of AlphaGo, which I think is called Alpha Zero, was not even given. So in neither case, it was given the rules of the game. It was just given a lot of games to look at and to extrapolate some sort of pattern. Now, out of that, it would create models, and then it would compete with other players, and it would learn more and more. With the latest version, they didn't give any indication of what the game was, what the objective was, only what the utility function should optimize for, which was the result. Then the game found it's by competing with versions of itself that were randomly created trillions and trillions of times over, and it found ways to essentially beat itself and play a game against itself with multiple variations of itself and almost limitless number of time. And within a few days, this thing blew everything out of the water, including the previous AI, which had watched millions of hours of plays from the grandmasters. So this is the speed of narrow AI. Very specialized, but this thing had to be programmed by human beings at the beginning. So my point isn't that AI suddenly is going to make all the jobs vanish. My point is that very smart human beings who are using TensorFlow and deep learning and some of these techniques and programs, they can essentially outperform thousands or millions of other human beings unaided by machines.
So, but do you see that as you don't see that as a concern for? I mean, if we just are looking at self-driving, if we look at autonomous vehicles specifically, that cuts out a significant portion of the jobs here in America.
About 3% of the working population.
So, what do we? I mean, do you think universal basic income is an answer to that, or is it? What do we need to do?
It could be, but my point is that there is no switch that you lose your job, great. 3% of the working population lost their job. They're between 45 and 60 years old. What are they going to do? Let's give them basic income. Fine. I suspect most of them will either die soon, because that's what people do when they don't have a sense of purpose in life and they suddenly go and collect their pension. A lot of workers who've been working 20, 30, 40 years, they retire. A few years later, they're dead, because they don't know what to do with their life. So basic income in itself isn't necessarily going to solve anything, except maybe pacify people who might be very angry because they're hungry. But it's not by itself going to solve anything in society. The reason the basic income might work in a place like Norway or Sweden or Finland, it's because they've had 50 years of social programs that have done a great job at educating people and being productive member of society in general. Look at the number of people who read books. Look at the number of people who... most watched TV show in Norway was a fucking train going around Norway in silence.
Yeah. Now,
what is the most watched program in the US?
NCIS.
Ugh.
So, at what point do you think the tipping point will be for the U.S.? Because obviously, as soon as the swaths of populations begin losing jobs because of once this automation process begins with AI, do you think there's ever going to be a tipping point when, obviously, as you said, 3% of the population, people that are mainly in the later stages of their life, close to quote-unquote retirement age, probably aren't going to tip the scale. But at what point does the scale tip into the point where the U.S. suddenly has the incentive?
That's just for drivers.
Yeah.
It's just for drivers. 7 years ago, I predicted that within 20 years, 45 to 50% of jobs will be irreversibly automated, and for which there wouldn't be a replacement, and people would not find a replacement. So I predict, you lose 100 jobs, you make 10 new jobs, so you lost 90%. So if you lose 50% of the population, 5% finds another job, 45% is done. Right? So that is a tipping point.
And one of the classic things they always say is that, oh, well, yes, you're going to have those jobs lost, but there are new jobs that are going to be created. But do you think...
Yeah, but there's a very few.
Yeah, not a third... Yeah, exactly.
There's a very few for the exact same reason that I told you about, because you don't have machines suddenly becoming aware and becoming super intelligent, and it's people outperforming other people.
Mm-hmm.
With the aid of machines. That's what's happening. You have one person plus a few AI algorithms and AWS instances from Amazon doing the job of previously a million people.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's what startups do. They automate, they optimize. So there is going to be a tipping point, and the answer is not an easy one. Basic income cannot be the sole answer. It can be a piece of a larger puzzle. But unless you address the big issues in America, which Martin Luther King was talking about, and the CIA and the FBI tried to, put him down for that. He was labeled a terrorist because he said, among other things, that poverty was the greatest form of violence. Okay? So on one side, I think we have to, again, move away from the rhetoric and look at results. For example, you look at liberals who want to do good, but in reality, most of them are full of shit. They don't want to do good. They want to look good, pat themselves in the back, tell themselves they're doing a great job, but not solving anything. So if you look, for example, at the population of African Americans, who are, by and large, disproportionately disadvantaged economically, and a large fraction of black men are in prison. Okay, so their kids are more likely to go and join a gang or to become criminals. Now, the answer of the liberal side is, let's do affirmative action. Let's give a few kids who don't deserve it scholarships so they can get an education. Well, what about the kids who did deserve it and were just as poor but just didn't happen to be black? What if they were from Latin America, or they were from India, or or they were Caucasians? Like, as soon as you step into that idea, that rhetoric, you become completely corrupt. Because the idea of affirmative action sounds good, but when you look at the results, it's actually a disastrous program which has never yielded positive results and has never done anything good in the long term. And in fact, it's even created more harm than it was proposing to solve, because the kids who would receive these grants and these scholarships, they didn't have the intellectual capacity to be at the level of the Ivy League schools, and then they would feel completely inadequate in those environments. So imagine you are someone with an IQ of 105 or 110. You're not stupid, but you're not the smartest kid in the block, and you're at Stanford. You are at the bottom of your class. You're always the last one. You always get the lowest grades, but you have a scholarship, so you're there. Most of these kids, they leave. They don't finish because they were not in the place where they belonged. Instead, if they had gone to another college where people were more at their level, they were more incentivized to continue because they had peers they could work with, they could study with, they could relate with, right? And this has been shown over and over for the past 25 years. Despite the evidence of affirmative action not working ever, liberals still pursue this policy because they say it's a great thing to do ideally, but it doesn't work, and it actually creates more harm than good. But as soon as you say we shouldn't do affirmative action, people are like, oh, you don't believe poor kids should get an opportunity? You're like, no, I think it's just a stupid way of solving the problem. The problem is that their fathers are in jails. They don't have any teachers who are male who can be a role model. The only male people that they see are fucking gangsters. So you're asking why they're joining a gang?
I think you're painting with a pretty broad brush. I mean, I understand the idea of data, but how do you then create a program that does appeal? But because you're stereotyping to a pretty strong degree.
You do it the hard way by attacking the real problem, which is a lot of these fathers who are African American males in their adulthood who are in jail for unjust reasons, for petty crimes, because they were born in economically disadvantaged places, who didn't give them a lot of opportunities, but society has shied away from them and has pushed them to the sides by locking them up and saying goodbye. And this has created a waterfall of other problems which people don't want to deal with because they're complex. It takes a lot of hard work. It takes social programs. It takes reskilling, retraining. It takes psychologists. It takes a lot of hard work and decades of dedication to solve the big problem of structural inequality, poverty, and access to economic opportunity and education, and particularly to bring back people who have been completely forgotten by society because they're called criminals. And the level of recidivity, so people going back to prisons after they have served their term in the US is higher than any other developed country. And this is the reason, because the hard problems are not being addressed. And they try to find a palliative solution by putting a few $1 million and calling it affirmative action, patting yourself in the back, saying you're doing a good job. You're not solving any problem, but you're saying, I'm really good because I think about people. That's the hypocrisy of the liberals that prevent them from actually solving the issues that are plaguing American society.
So then what would you suggest the idea of, as you mentioned, that this is basically being in a boat with holes on every side, and you're just patching one and expecting the boat to stay afloat. Then how do you start addressing these issues? Do you start with one at a time? Because as you said, these are creating waterfalls of effects.
Yeah, you start with one at a time, but you continue. You don't pick one, then plaster all over the news that this is the silver bullet solution that makes everything right, and then expect it to work because it's delusional. And you look at places where they've done it successfully. I mean, I don't want to bang on this, but Norway has the lowest recidivity in the world, right? Criminals in Norway are not criminals. They're people who have committed a crime, which is different. Because as soon as you call someone a criminal, it's like calling someone a loser. It's not someone who has failed. He is a failure. The moment you say someone is a failure, you're identifying that person forever with failure. If you just say he has failed once, maybe twice, but he can do it again, and maybe he will succeed. And the same is for people who have committed a crime. These are people. They may have committed a crime for many reasons. Maybe they were angry. Maybe they had some chemical imbalance in their brain temporarily. Maybe they were born in a uncomfortable and unjust situation which has led them to a series of action which has led them to the necessity for committing a crime. There are many reasons people might commit a crime, right? And if you're not addressing the reasons why people are committing the crime in the first place, you're not going to solve future crimes. And the ones that are now in jail, you essentially, the US system, the US prison system takes people who might or might not be low-level criminals and it turns them into actual criminals once they get into jail.
You get your education that you talked about, but the wrong kind.
Yeah.
If you were to solve this by starting with one issue and then moving forward, what would you pick up? What would be the first thing you'd pick up and address? The prison system, the way the criminal justice system works?
I mean, I don't think there is one issue. I think, you have a budget, you have limited resources, you start the program and you try to see things that have worked in the past somewhere else. So, for example, there is a lot of examples, for example, that after-school programs reduce the amount of criminality among young kids and people joining gangs, and because it gives them a sense of community, a sense of purpose, and it allows them to express themselves in many ways. Creatively, they might do work in the garden, or they might learn how to play an instrument, or to carve wood, or learn skills of programming. I mean, there are lots of things that people can do if they're given the opportunity and the space. If you are in a low-income neighborhood where everyone around you is poor and is black, and most people are criminals and their fathers are in jail, and you finish school and there is nothing to do, what the hell do you think you can do?
Mm.
Give them some opportunities. So after school program seems to work, well, then do more after school programs. And then try to address the fact that these fathers are missing. Because a lot of these kids, they don't have a father figure. You don't see, I mean, the sisters of these young men, they're equally disadvantaged economically. They live in the same neighborhood, but they don't commit as many crimes. Why? Because they have a mother figure in the home doing 2 jobs, feeding the family and keeping them afloat. They have a strong woman who's wearing the fucking pants in the house and can be a role model for the girl. So they don't commit crimes. But the boys, they don't have any father figure who's not a criminal, and they go to school and they're all female because there is huge discrimination against men in elementary and middle school who want to teach because they don't get hired. So they don't have a father figure to look at. They don't see any man in their vicinity who is not a criminal, who's doing good things. So how the hell are we supposed to expect these young black kids to grow up and do something good if they don't have any role model to aspire at in their community?
Well, is it really? I mean, I feel like there's been a lot of focus on black kids, and I'm curious also about what you said about there being discrimination against men in teaching jobs. I'm not familiar with that information. I
mean, it's just an example, but it's it's part of it. It's part of a big of a big waterfall of problems, mm-hmm. Right? So in these communities, there is a lot of crime. A lot of people are in disadvantaged situations, and there is a lot of issues with also sexual misconduct or rape and things of that sort. So there is a bias against male teachers in elementary schools and high schools. Just don't get hired as much. And blind studies have shown over and over that if you cover the names of the applicants, they get hired like 4 times as they're 4 times more likely to get hired if they don't know they're a man.
All right. Well, thank you for explaining that. We got to wrap it up, but I wanted to ask really quickly. Well, I guess two things, but we'll start with this. If there's one thing that if people are interested in trying to solve some of these problems, is there anything that you would recommend that I or Tommy or anybody listening to the show could go out and do to start making progress in this regard? Because I mean, obviously you're putting effort into it yourself, so hopefully there's something that individuals can do to make some progress here.
Start from your own community. I mean, clean your room in a way, like sort yourself out. When I started, when I was a 17, 16-year-old kid, thinking I want to change the world, I want, to change everything, and I have these very kind of idealistic liberal ideas. Mm-hmm. I still have the values, but I don't have that attitude anymore, because now I understand that the things that I can impact are the ones that are either in my immediate surroundings, my vicinities, my community, or individual companies or organizations that I can get involved with, and that I can impact. But for most people, I would say start with your own community. Here in San Francisco, where I'm at now, there is people who are making literally billions of dollars, okay? And they're walking by the street and they see homeless people sleeping on the streets. Silicon Valley is the epicenter of innovation and wealth, and it has a huge homeless population. People are just there. It's like they're invisible. They don't even look at them. So start with your own community, clean your own damn room, and don't tell others that they should become better people. Do it yourself, and then be an example to them, hopefully.
I think that's a good idea.
Agreed.
Just before we go, Federico, thanks for joining us. And if anyone wants to find out more about what you're doing and your work, where would you direct them to online?
Oh yeah, they can go to fede.online, fede.online. That's my website, and you can find all about it over there.
Great. We'll have a link in the show notes and on the video, although those who are watching that right now know that already. So thank you so much for joining us today. It was a very interesting conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And
thank you for inviting me. My pleasure.
All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll talk to you next time.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Supercharged. If you'd like to send in a comment or a question, you can do so on awkward.email. You just go on your web browser to awkward.email. It's actually a website. And you can call or text 509-AWKWARD instead if you'd like to just skip all of that and do it from your phone. Also, if you'd like to check out some of our other shows, we've got a lot of great shows now, and we're having more every day, or, eventually. You can do that on awkwardhuman.com/podcast. Go check it out. We've got a lot of good stuff, and we hope that you'll be listening every week. Thanks.